Carol. We have Carol, who is the only professional in this group, and yet she ends up with a handle, because of her professionalism, as known as the Blonde Bracero. You know, do any of you remember what braceros were? That's how long Carol's been doing this. So Carol, you were like a young lass when you got interested in wine. It was kind of like almost accidental, and you had, like many of us, the European experience, but it was different, right?
Yes, I did. When I was 15, my parents said, we're moving across the country from upstate New York, where I grew up, and we're going to go to Africa on the way. Kind of not really on the way from New York to California, but we started our tour in Paris and then completed our tour of Africa in Greece. So it was a lovely sojourn, and then drove to California and started another life there.
And Zinfandel was not the first wine you tasted.
No. When I was in Paris the first night, we went to...
At 15?
At 15. I had a few New York wines along the way, but I'd never really had real wine because New York was still based all in Native American varietals and not even hybrids yet. And so we had champagne, French champagne, at the Moulin Rouge. And I was so enamored with the wine. I was just fascinated with it. It was real wine, and I was really enjoying it. And it took me quite a while to realize that the women didn't have any clothes on. I still have the cork.
I don't think that was my experience when I was young.
Now, if they'd been Chippendales, I don't know.
That would have been good. So you ended up having some older sisters who went to school and studied liberal arts, and you wanted to study something besides winemaking, didn't you?
Yeah, I actually wanted to study language. I was really into Latin, French, Spanish, English. I get them a little confused these days. It kind of comes out as a big mixture of Franglais, Frespagnol, and whatever else. But I also wanted to study poetry under Robert Frost. And he died when I was in high school, so that was a bit difficult.
Good going.
My parents were saying, phew, because...
You'd be speaking an iambic pentameter now.
I would. We'd be taking many roads not taken. But my parents told me that we have paid for 3 liberal arts degrees with your older siblings, and none of them have jobs. So we would like you to take something in the more technical range, and maybe you'll get a job when you get out. My mom said, look at the food profession. I was taught to cook from the age of 3 or 4 because my mom didn't know how to cook when she got married. So she made sure we were all cooking very young, and she said, look at the food profession. You'll always have a job, and you'll always eat. So I went that way and said, wine, this is the most creative science. It gives me a chance to mess with things artistically, subjectively, but also do a lot of science and entertain my little analytical side, because I'm kind of a classic Gemini. Got the arts and sciences fighting each other. Fantastic.
And then you, so you ended up in winemaking, but you just didn't walk into Davis. You went someplace else first. You told me that you were enamored with aromas and bouquet. You walked into Sebastiani, and what happened?
I took a tour of Sebastiani as a freshman because I still had not declared my major. I was still hoping I could convince my parents to let me study poetry. And I took a tour of Sebastiani where all the big, tall casks are carved on the faces. And just walking in the room, the aroma of oak saturated with red wine, I said, I want to smell this at my job for the rest of my life. And I do. Although it becomes like your perfume. You don't smell it so much anymore. Walking in the room anymore. But.
So you went to Davis, and your class had some interesting folks in it. Who else was learned to make wine in that class?
Oh, we had a real who's who. We had Doug Nall, John Kongsgaard, John Williams from Frog's Leap. Kathy Corison was one of the only other women that graduated. Kathy and I were among the first dozen or so women to graduate the wine program at UC Davis. And it was not easy coming out of Davis as a woman, because they wanted to pigeonhole you either in the lab or in the sales area, and you were really not invited to go into the cellar. And in fact, in many places I had gone in my early career, there were people in the cellar, largely men, mostly all men, who said, women aren't allowed here because they carry yeast infections and you could infect the wine. That was a serious belief. think it was meant to keep us down.
Candida albicans of wine. That's a really interesting disease. I mean, like, oh, right.
Yep.
So, but you managed to infect lots of cellars along the way. So, so where did you work, Carol? Which one should we avoid?
No. They're better because of it. No, I right out of school, I worked at Robert Mondavi doing small lot research. And then I worked in Australia for Peter Lehman at Saltram's in the Barossa Valley. And then, because you could do spring crush, that way I could get 2 crushes in 1 year, little overachiever. And then I came back and worked at United Vintners in Madeira, very large factory. You literally used a golf cart or a bicycle to get from one side to the other.
That'll take the love out of winemaking.
Yeah, it sure as hell did.
And that's where you became the blonde Bracero, right?
Yes. Boy, you remember well. I was doing small lot research again, and what that meant was I would do everything from picking the grapes in the vineyard. That's what a bracero is a farm worker, essentially. So in order to make sure that we got the grapes that were designated for our lot, I was the one picking them. And we would turn them into 5-gallon demijohns, and we had hundreds of 5-gallon demijohns and carried them all the way through to bottling. But I left before I got any of the results because I was offered a nice job in the North Coast, a real winemaking job at Buena Vista. And I was lucky enough to work with Andrei Chelichev there. He was a consultant. He spread his influence and his love of wine everywhere.
He did.
He really
And
did.
he was very exciting and enthusiastic about wine. He was also, did he ever hit on you, Carol?
Yes, he did.
He was known to be sort of a ladies' man.
Yes, not quite as bad as Mike Gergich, but he... Mike will actually feel you up, still. But Andre would come, he's shorter than I am, and I'm 5'1.5" and Andre was about 4'10" or 11, and he'd come into the lab and he'd say, "How are my ladies in the lab?" And I'd say, "I'm the only one here." And he said, "No, not you. The girls are in the vineyard, the ladies are in the cellar, the grapes, the wines. So the girls are the grapes and the wines are the ladies."
He was also an obsessive smoker. Mm-hmm. He always had 2 cigarettes going at the same time, and
Yep.
it was like pretty remarkable.
Yeah, he would go over to the window, puff, 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 come back and taste.
Yeah. So you did really well at Buena Vista. You liked it, and then you moved on. And how did that happen? How did you end up going to the Windsor area?
Well, I was offered a job at Rodney Strong and Windsor. At the time, it was not called Rodney Strong yet. It was 1980, but 81 early, and they did not have the Rodney Strong brand. Rodney Strong was the figurehead winemaker of the brand, but they were called Sonoma Vineyards, and he created Windsor Vineyards first, and it was entirely direct-to-consumer through 3 tasting rooms, New York, Tiburon, and so at the winery, and then all this personalized labels, which came about because people wanted him to hold wine, so he'd put their names on the labels and stash them away, and then they would come and pick them up, and their name would be on there. So that became a big gig for Windsor. And when I started at Windsor, it was myself and Rick Sayer doing both the 2 brands together. And then in 1990, when this picture was taken, actually, they split us a little bit. We were at the same facility, but Rick was in charge of Rodney Strong, which had been created in 1983, and I was in charge of the Windsor brand, and I inherited about 25 different wines to bottle, and by the time I left, there were 48 different wines. I did it myself. I really screwed myself. I got really excited about a new vineyard or a new varietal, and I'd go to the marketers at Windsor and I'd say, "I've got this Carignan vineyard. Please don't make me blend it out. I know it'll shine. It's going to sell." And they let me bottle it, and it sold out in 2 months. And they went, "Oh, okay. What's the next suggestion you have?" So I ended up making 7 different Chardonnays, 7 different Cabernets. This was before a lot of vineyard designates. Rod Strong was actually one of the first people in the whole Americas to call a wine by its vineyard designated name. So we eventually ended up making all these different wines, and just who I am, I didn't want them to taste alike. I really wanted to show what each vineyard could do, so I would adapt my winemaking to make the vineyard shine. So that's where I really gained my chops, I feel. Davis was lovely. It gave me the background. and it gave me the troubleshooting ability. But what it really did at Rodney Strong and Windsor was teach me how to blend and create these different stylistic choices.
So typicity for you is a really big deal. So what do you think about? How do you get there? I mean, you know, we all make wine, you know, but we have to think of the vineyard first, or at least I do, and I know you do. So how do you make sure that the vineyard shines and comes out first?
A lot of it is picking it a lot less ripe than some people do. So I'm aiming at 24 and a half to 25 and a half. And what I find is the thing that most neutralizes the difference between vineyards is too high of a sugar at harvest, which means too much alcohol, too much residual sugar in the wine, and too much oak. They flatten out any differences in terroir at all. So I'm aiming at a little lower sugar at harvest than some people, and I keep my alcohols in the mid-low 14s for the most part, and my oak is predominantly more used, and I have about a third new usually, and I split it between French and American. So as the winery's grown, I've been able to afford more French. So we're tending to head a little bit that way, but.
So, you know, so you worked with all these other people. You just about got killed in the United Vintners in terms of love of wine. And you did the whole thing at Windsor and did quite well. I mean, you were considered to be one of the great winemakers of California. And you got married to Mitch in, like, what, 1984? Was that right?
We met in 84 and we got married in 88.
Yeah,
we lived in Sin for 4 years.
So Mitch is about 3 times taller than you are.
Yeah, he's here somewhere.
He's a big guy.
He's 6'5".
And so Carol would come home from her job every day, and she'd have a certain number of complaints. And finally, Mitch became the enabler. And what did he say to you?
He said, "Get your ass out of Windsor. You're never going to be appreciated for what you do," because I was always, in many people's minds, the blonde bimbo in the lab. And they didn't realize that I was the one that was creating the wines. Windsor was winning more medals than anyone in the country for 15 years in a row. And that was documented. There were a number of little books that track competitions. And every year we'd come out, "Yay, we did it again." And I was winemaker of the year 3-4 times, whatever. But everyone assumed that it was because Rick was making the wine still. And I'd been doing it for 10 years, and 10 years before that. So it was something that I was not being appreciated, and the corporate crap that you have to take working for a large company, whether it's a winery or any other kind of business, I'd had it up to here. And Mitch said, "It's time. We got to get out and let you shine and let you do the right thing." So he's been my strongest supporter. His biggest complaint is that we didn't do it soon enough. And I was rather attached to Windsor because I had a great sales team there. We had a lot of telemarketers, over 100 telemarketers, and they loved selling my wine, so they tell me I made it easy for them to sell. So when I walk into the room, I got a standing ovation before I open my mouth, and that was kind of hard to leave.
Yeah. So you basically traded corporate BS for small winery penury. You know, you began to find out what it was like to start a small winery. So you started this little winery, and you made these wines, and I understand you owe Zap a debt of gratitude.
I sure as heck do. People always ask me why I chose Zin, and one of the reasons was Zap, because I had a ready-made marketing organization right here. And in our first year, when I left Windsor Vineyards, it was the turn of the century in 1999. I went to them and said, "I think I'm ready to leave and do my own thing." And they said, "Oh, good, let us help you. Give you money." I went, "What? I'm telling you I'm leaving?" And they said, "No, we're going to sell the winery. Windsor Vineyards is being sold to Beringer Blas, and you're not going to be the winemaker anymore." And we knew you weren't going to like that, so we were wondering how to tell you. So they gave me a very nice severance, and it bought all my grapes and my barrels and my custom crush fees, because, of course, when you start out, you don't have a building or any place to do it. And I did a big fancy business plan, something I'd never done before, and made my own S-Corp, did all the legalities, trademark names, all kinds of stuff. And suddenly it came around to bottling. We'd been hemorrhaging money because small wineries cost a lot more than big wineries. And I didn't have enough money to buy my glass. So I brought samples to Zap, and I sold futures. So anybody that bought futures of my wine, you paid for my glass. Everything in this winery, we've never gone out and gotten a loan until about 10 years in. We've been doing it for 17 years now. And we put all of our profits back into the winery to grow. So where we started at about 1,800 cases, we're now 18,000 cases. And yeah, it's all due to good crowds at ZAP and appreciation from people like you.
So, Carol, are you paying yourself a salary yet?
Finally, last year. Yeah, we took out just enough to pay our mortgage at home, and that was about it. So we kind of lived on some savings.
Yeah, you know, the things you do for love.
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing. Yeah, so you're doing single vineyards now. You do, and you have great names for them. You don't just call them the name of the vineyard. You kind of like create something more. So there's things like Manga and Rocky, and you know they all have these kind of like springy names. And so tell us a little bit about that, and tell us about your wines.
Sure. We make the Wild Thing, and that name came about because I was doing yeast trials, which was something that Windsor allowed me to do a lot of experimentation. And one of my trials was to not yeast, and then I would use various commercial strains of yeast, compared them, and I convinced Windsor, another new SKU for them to sell was the Wild Thing, and they put it in little tiny print, Wild Thing, on the label. And we had been talking about it. We said, top the barrels that were yeasted with this, and top the barrels yeasted with that, and top the Wild Thing over there. And everybody laughed, thought it was funny because of the song and the baseball player and whatever. So we ended up sticking it on the wine, and then when I left, I took it in my severance agreement, and it was the first thing that we trademarked. And so that's our main wine, and it's 10,000 cases. But Mangazin comes from Cucamonga. Rocky Reserve, which you have in front of you, is from Rock Pile. And I was blessed to have a good friend, Kent Rosenblum, who was starting the Rock Pile appellation and needed the support of another winery to show that wines were different from Rock Pile versus Dry Creek down below. And the first year out, my 2000 Rocky got a 5-star gold at the Orange County Fair within a week or two of bottling. And we did really well with Rock Pile ever since. And we all agreed that in order to get the appellation approved, we would not put the name of the appellation in a trademark name, because they won't then allow it to be an appellation. So I called it Rocky Reserve as a short for Rock Pile, and also because I had a rocky start to the winery. I had another vineyard that I was committed to buy, and my grower wasn't as committed. Her ex-husband had sold the fruit to somebody else, and I didn't know until early August when I called up Kent and said, "Hey, buddy, you got 5 tons that are really cherry I can use?" And he stepped right up and offered me some Rock Pile. So I was in on the ground floor of that founding of that appellation, thanks to Kent. And so these 2 wines are the 04 and the 14. I decided to show you a 10-year gap. My wines tend to age very well, and they get a little bit perhaps more European tasting, a little earthier, more integrated when they get older, as all red wines do, but they stand up quite well. They have enough acidity and enough low alcohol that they age really well. So that's the difference between the 2. The only other difference, they're the same vineyard, pretty much the same vinification method, but the 14 has about 14% Petit Syrah blended in, because Jack Florence found a little acre that he hadn't quite planted yet. He's cleared out the brush and planted me an acre of Petit. So that's blended in.
The magic Zinfandel, mate, that Petit Syrah. Carol,
right.
Thank you very much. Thanks
You're
for
welcome.
what you do. Keep up Proceroing. You're doing a great job.
Thanks.